We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America. Nobody's going to get around that.
Sandy, the Prime Minister's message today was bolster and protect. Bolster the steel industry by growing the domestic market and protect by reducing the amount of foreign steel allowed into Canada.
President Donald Trump surprised countries around the world last week by announcing he would double tariffs on metal imports to 50%.
We still continue to believe that it would be a mistake.
At first glance, this story looks simple. Another trade dispute, another tariff announcement, another political standoff between Washington and Ottawa. Headlines framed it as Canada reacting defensively to Trump's 50% steel tariffs, as if this were just another episode of economic muscle flexing from a larger power toward a smaller one. But when you slow down and look past the surface narrative, a very different picture begins to emerge. One that has far less to do with short-term retaliation and far more to do with long-term leverage, industrial survival, and who actually absorbs the pain when trade wars escalate. Before we go any further, if you value calm, fact-based analysis that looks beyond the headlines, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and share this video. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Understanding how these economic shifts affect real people depends on having voices from everywhere. What's happening here is not simply about steel, it's about dependence, it's about vulnerability, and it's about what happens when a country decides it can no longer afford to have its economic future determined by political decisions made elsewhere. On paper, the logic behind tariffs is straightforward. Raise the cost of imported steel, weaken foreign producers, protect domestic industry, and force concessions at the negotiating table. For decades, that approach worked because the imbalance of power was clear. Larger markets could squeeze smaller suppliers, and those suppliers usually had little choice but to comply. When your primary customer suddenly shuts the door, the consequences can be devastating. Layoffs follow, communities suffer, governments scramble to limit the damage. And for Canadian steelworkers facing uncertainty, none of this feels abstract. It feels personal. It feels like your job, your income, and your future are being used as bargaining chips in a political strategy you had no say in. But this is where the story starts to diverge from the usual script. Ottawa's response was not rushed, it was not panicked, and it was not improvised at the last minute. The signals coming out of Canada suggest that policymakers anticipated this pressure well before the tariffs officially landed. Instead of waiting to react, they began preparing for a scenario in which access to the US market could no longer be taken for granted. Rather than clinging to a model that relied overwhelmingly on American demand, Canadian officials quietly began laying the groundwork for a transition. Funding was allocated to stabilize major steel producers. Coordination with provincial governments intensified, and planning began around retooling production lines to serve domestic industries rather than foreign buyers. From the outside, this can easily be dismissed as political messaging. Governments often discuss resilience and diversification without implementing meaningful change. But when you examine the mechanics behind these moves, it becomes clear that this isn't just rhetoric. It represents a deliberate shift in how Canadian steel fits into the country's broader economic strategy. Why does that matter? Because steel is not just another export. It sits at the core of critical supply chains. Housing construction, infrastructure projects, shipbuilding, defense procurement, and manufacturing all depend on it. When a country's steel sector is heavily dependent on one external market, it becomes vulnerable to sudden policy shocks. We've seen this pattern before across multiple industries. Steel is simply the latest and most visible example. For years, sending steel south made sense. The US auto industry demanded it, supply chains were integrated, and profits were steady. But efficiency often masks fragility. The moment tariffs make that steel uncompetitive, the entire model collapses. In the past, the typical response would have been to seek exemptions, negotiate carve-outs, or retaliate with counter-tariffs in hopes of restoring the old balance. Canadian steel producers are now positioning themselves to supply domestic shipyards, infrastructure projects, and defense programs. These are areas where demand is driven by national priorities, not foreign political cycles. When a government controls the spending and timelines, tariffs imposed elsewhere lose much of their power. Some of these shifts are already visible. New procurement agreements with Canadian shipbuilders are not symbolic gestures. They are multi-year commitments tied to large federal projects. That kind of demand creates predictability, something steel producers have not had in a long time. Still, none of this erases the human cost unfolding right now. For workers in steel towns, a long-term strategy does little to ease immediate anxiety. Layoffs are not theoretical. They disrupt families, drain savings, and force difficult choices, and it's important to acknowledge that reality rather than gloss over it. Transitions like this almost always hit workers first and hardest. As steel production shifts toward domestic needs, it aligns with sectors that are themselves growing. A country facing a housing shortage requires steel. A country investing in infrastructure requires steel. A country modernizing its naval and defense capabilities requires specialized steel products. These needs persist regardless of who occupies the White House. That stability changes the balance of power. Tariffs are effective only when dependence runs in one direction, when the targeted country relies far more on the foreign market than the foreign market relies on them. But as domestic demand grows and alternative customers emerge, that asymmetry begins to shrink. What once felt like economic coercion becomes background noise. Threats lose their impact when the leverage behind them weakens. Trump's tariffs did not create these vulnerabilities. They exposed them. The reliance on a single export market, the lack of diversification, and the concentration of risk were built over many years. The tariffs were simply the trigger that revealed how precarious the system had become. What Canada is attempting now is not a response to one administration. It is an adaptation to a more volatile global environment. Stable, predictable trade is no longer the norm. Politics, pandemics, climate shocks, and security concerns are reshaping supply chains. Countries that recognize this reality and invest in resilience stand a better chance of weathering future disruptions. But success depends on accountability. Public investment must come with conditions. Worker protections matter. Community support matters. Retraining programs must lead to real jobs, not empty promises. Without these safeguards, industrial policy risks becoming corporate welfare, where public money absorbs private risk while workers are left exposed. Ultimately, the question isn't whether restructuring is necessary. It's who bears the cost and who reaps the benefits. An economy that socializes losses while privatizing gains cannot sustain trust or stability. As this story continues to unfold, it's worth asking deeper questions. Who benefits from the current system? Who pays when it breaks down? And what kind of economy do we actually want to build? Because trade wars may dominate the headlines, but beneath them lies a far more important struggle over economic security, political stability, and the future of work itself. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, subscribe to the channel, share the video, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter, and understanding them is the first step toward building something more stable than what we have now.